I want to welcome every person who is watching Civic Nebraska's first ever live stream Strengthening Democracy event. For those watching who are longtime supporters of Civic Nebraska, I welcome you back and thank you for braving this online version of our annual event. For those new to the organization and mission, I warmly welcome you. My name is Adam Moorfeld. I'm the Executive Director and founder of Civic Nebraska. We are a nonpartisan organization committed to creating a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans. Before I introduce the organization and our panelists tonight, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the disruption caused by COVID-19. Not only for those who work at Civic Nebraska and support Civic Nebraska, but my heart goes out to all of the folks that have been displaced due to the turbulence of these unprecedented times. I want to acknowledge and deeply thank particularly healthcare professionals, first responders, grocers, teachers, food and agricultural workers, first responders, and many more members of the workforce providing essential goods and services across Nebraska. You haven't stopped working, and we're so thankful for these heroes who continue to maintain safety, health, and security across our state. And finally, I want to thank everyone for watching tonight, because it means so much to share this space with you, even if it is virtual. Strengthening Democracy has historically been one of Civic Nebraska's major annual fundraisers, a celebration where hundreds gather to honor Nebraskans to make our state stronger through powerful acts of civic engagement, embodying our core values of innovation and community. We are excited to welcome you to the first ever Civic Nebraska live stream event on this scale. To help give you a bigger picture of who we are, we thought we should start at the beginning of our story. Civic Nebraska basically started in my dorm room, for many of you that know us and know me well. And even though I lost my student government election at the University of Nebraska, it ignited a deeper passion for engaging younger people in their democracy through voting. And so we gathered a few like-minded friends that were politically diverse, our deputy director, Amanda Barker, one of them included, and started Civic Nebraska. And at the time, we were called Nebraskans for Civic Reform, and we were 100% volunteer run for 3 years. Fast forward today, nearly 12 years later, Civic Nebraska is thriving with over 30 full-time staff and 80 part-time staff. Our mission is straightforward, and if you ask me, more important than ever. Civic Nebraska works every day to create a more modern, robust democracy for all Nebraskans. Civic Nebraska divided into 3 program areas, including civic health, youth civic leadership, and voting rights, all working in tandem to invest in the lives of Nebraskans. The primary goal that guides each of these program areas is to strengthen our pillars of social and civic health, enabling residents to feel more confident in their political institutions, more socially connected to their home and neighbors, holistically increase civic engagement, and help individuals feeling more empowered to participate politically. This is also known as feeling empowered to vote. And this is where I'm really excited to introduce our panelists and voting rights conversation tonight. I'm so excited to welcome our special guest and presenter, Amber McReynolds. Amber is a CEO for the National Vote at Home Institute and Coalition and is the former director of elections for Denver, Colorado, and also a friend of mine. Among many accomplishments, including co-authoring When Women Vote, Amber and her team are national leaders in designing pro-voter policies. I want to welcome you, Amber. We're so excited to have you with us here tonight.
Well, I'm excited to be here, Adam, and I appreciate you guys inviting me to come. Just for, if you give me 1 second, I kind of had a Zoom failure on my computer, so I came over here to the to the phone. I'm going to try to see if I can get back in here while I start. Apologize.
No worries, Amber. We all know how that goes. The best.
Yeah, literally right as you were like, it like froze up, and so I was like, oh my goodness. So I called in.
Of course it did.
I'm trying to, I know, I'm like, oh, I had it all ready to go, and now it froze up. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and I especially am excited to celebrate the amazing successes that Nebraska had this week with conducting a primary election amid a pandemic. And okay, now I'm going to switch over really quick. because it's not going to work so well on the phone. Okay, I'm going to wait for Steve to let me in. I'm going to switch real quick. Sorry.
No worries, Amber.
Okay.
There you are. Okay, we'll let you take it from here.
I'm back. I'm so sorry. Really an honor to be here for the Strengthening Democracy Awards ceremony and this discussion with Westin tonight. Civic Nebraska is an incredible organization that we enjoy being partners with, and the work that we've been able to do collectively together and in support of all of your efforts in Nebraska has, I think, really paid dividends, and it's really exciting to be here to celebrate this. So first and foremost, as Adam mentioned, we've been friends a while, and in my role, I'm the CEO of the National Vote at Home Institute. I did recently co-author a book that was just released in January, which is really exciting. It was a first ever for me, for sure. And then prior to that, I was an election official for 14 years, serving as director of elections in Denver. I've driven through Nebraska many times because originally I am from Illinois. So I live in Denver, Colorado now, but originally from Illinois. And my parents still live there. So I even recently have been back and forth a few times. So very familiar with the state, and was able to spend some time last year there with Civic Nebraska, meeting with a couple of the election officials around the state. So as director of elections in Denver, just a quick story to sort of open. I started in the office when I was about 26 years old. Prior to that, had done my master's overseas, had worked at a civic engagement organization, actually helping to register voters and educate young voters on college campuses across Iowa during the 2004 election. And that's when I really got introduced to the significant barriers and challenges that exist throughout the election process. And so in that job, I was traveling to Denver quite a bit for trainings and meetings and all of that, and ended up loving the city and decided to try to move there. And so I started looking for a job, but I started looking for jobs that would put me in election administration, actually working at an election office. And when I started in Denver, I was one of the youngest to be in the office. And also, as I started there, I found out very quickly that the office overall didn't really put customers first. It didn't put voters first, had a lot of outdated technology. And the thing that I heard the most was, this is the way it's always been done. So we're going to keep doing it this way. And that was related to processes, but more we continue. Can you guys hear me? Okay. It's asking me to relaunch Zoom, so I got worried there for a second. Okay. So as I started in the elections office, I identified a lot of areas that we could improve. And many of those related to policies, but also most of them were just simply about putting voters first and improving the customer experience. And as I looked kind of outside of Denver and across the state of Colorado, and then started to have discussions nationally, I found that this was essentially the problem with elections broadly, in that they didn't really put, and the policies around elections didn't really put voters first. And so we set out to start, at the time I was a staffer, I set out to start making changes where I could. And then as I moved up into different leadership roles, I was able to make some decisions that brought new energy into the team, diversity of experience, and we were able to really improve the customer experience processes that we were delivering to voters in Denver. And then a few years after that, we were able to dive into policy changes at the state level and start redesigning the way that we were handling our election policies in the state, and put voters first and make the customer process easier for voters. And one of the ways that we did that is by about 2012 or so in Colorado, our voters were telling us a very clear message. And that message was that they wanted to get their ballot at home. So we had seen a significant growth in voters asking for their ballot to be mailed to them, so much so that it got to be about 72% of the state by 2012. And so after that time, we started rethinking how we were going to deliver election services going forward. And we designed our laws to be more of an opt-out rather than an opt-in process for voting at home. So what we did is we basically decided that we would automatically mail a ballot to every elector before every election, local, state, federal primaries, all of that. And that enabled us to give voters predictability, but it also enabled election officials to have more predictability in how they were planning elections. The second piece of the legislation involved modernizing our voter registration processes, because what we found is that a significant number of Coloradans were voting provisional ballots each election cycle. And it wasn't because they were brand new registrants. It was simply because they had either moved within their county or had moved across the state somewhere, and they were ending up voting a provisional ballot, which, by the way, costs about 10 times as much as a normal ballot to maybe there's a better way to do this. Think about how we could do our policies in a different way that would prevent so many provisional ballots from being cast. And so we modernized our registration system, and we analyzed the reasons voters were voting a provisional ballot and tried to make improvements around that. So we then decided to eliminate the voter registration deadline, allow automatic address updates, utilize government systems and data with automatic registration to make sure we had the most accurate address files that we could, and then also allow voters to update their address and change their registration, and also register for the first time on election day. The third piece of the legislation involved in-person voting. So we wanted to make sure that we could still offer voters that option if they wanted to vote in person, or if they want to drop their ballot off in person, or if they want to mail it back. Really, whatever they wanted to do, we wanted to make sure that we could accommodate them from a service perspective. So we created what was called vote centers, and that just means it's the same thing as a polling place, except that you can go to any vote center across your jurisdiction or even across the state in some circumstances. So that enabled voters to, again, get more flexibility in their choices. Maybe they were working in a different part of the county on a day and couldn't get all the way home to where their polling place was. So it enabled them more choice in the process. And that, again, reduced our provisional ballots and also made the process easier. So all of those things were combined into a package of reforms that we instituted and passed in terms of our legislation in 2013. And by the following year, we implemented all of those reforms within 6 months of passage. And then by the following year, we had we had one of the top turnouts in the country. Our voter registration rate went up to be the top in the country. And then we also saw higher engagement, higher turnout, more confidence. And we saw this huge streamlining of the voter and customer process that made things easier. So that's sort of the story of Colorado, in that we looked at it very much from a customer process, a customer service dimension, and that enabled us to make our laws work for voters and put voters first. Since that time, I ran elections then up until 2018 in that new model, and Colorado continued to break records in terms of turnout, and also became one of the safest states to vote in with the implementation of risk limiting audits. So since right around the fall of 2018, I decided to leave my position in Denver as director, and I came to head up the national, is to replicate a lot of things that we learned and that we implemented in Colorado, and then also preserve in-person options and help other states make those same improvements across the board. So we've been working on that for 2.5 years or so, and we've had a lot of great success across the country in terms of improving this process and making it work better for voters, which is the key. And then the pandemic hit, and as Adam mentioned, it's been an unprecedented crisis with regards to how we vote and really every aspect of our lives. So a couple months ago, with in the era of COVID, our work at the National Vote at Home Institute became even more critical because so many states were contemplating changes for their primary, and we saw a huge surge in, number one, the interest for vote by mail and vote at home, but also in the interest in addressing a significant vulnerability that was clearly identified with the pandemic that was happening across the country. And what we also found at that time is that when you look across the country, the systems that are more resilient to this type of situation are that of a Colorado or an Oregon or Washington or Utah or Hawaii, because they automatically mail a ballot to every elector. And so they have a lot more resiliency built in when dealing with a pandemic. So those states all had, they were able to conduct their elections as they planned to, and there wasn't as much disruption as what we saw across the country with delayed primaries, adjustments in procedures, all of those things. So there's sort of like, for the 2.5 years that we've been working on this, improving the customer process. And then there's the emergency situation that we're facing right now. And both of those two things are critical as we think about elections, as we think about what our policies look like going forward. Because what's interesting is, on the one hand, we can improve the customer's experience in the voter process. And on the other, we can address a significant vulnerability that we've now identified in the in-person voting structure with the model that Colorado passed, and now California has also passed, and other states have also adopted to. So there's a real opportunity for us to not only solve solutions that involve the safety of voters in polling places, but also consider long-term solutions that potentially improve the voting experience overall. And what I would also say is, for this year, and this is certainly our goal at the National Vote at Home Institute, but I believe a goal for every politician, anyone who works on these sorts of issues, and frankly, every voter across the country, should have a goal of making sure that every single voter can vote in a safe, secure, accessible manner, not only for really important pandemic is going to look like in the fall. And we don't know what the situation is going to be in a few months. And we're only 150 days or less now from military and overseas ballots being mailed out to voters for the general election. So the time to act is now. We've been saying that there's urgency around this issue, and we have to address the policy considerations, but also help election officials prepare for what is likely going to be the highest number of vote by mail ballots ever cast in a presidential election, based on all the trends that we're seeing right now. And sort of to move to Nebraska in particular, so much to celebrate with regards to the primary that happened this week. Record turnout. I heard from Weston today that there's a county that has 70% turnout. Tremendous success, and something that I hope all Nebraskans are really proud of, with turning out, engaging civically, even amongst a very difficult public health crisis. And the great thing is, all of the election officials and the Secretary of State's office all worked together to make sure that there were options, and good options, available for Nebraskans to vote. And that's what we really need all states to be doing right now, and taking action to make adjustments to these policies as we prepare for the November election. And finally, I would just leave you with, there's a real opportunity here to deliver and also strengthen democracy for every single elector and our systems overall ahead of November 2020, and then consider how we can continue to improve it for years to come. Because the one thing we never want to do is sort of stay stagnant, be okay with how we're currently doing things. We want to continuously improve, look for opportunities to make the voting process one that every single voter can be proud of, and certainly one that every elected official and every election official can be proud of, and one that makes it easy for voters to engage in that safe, secure, and accessible way. So with that, I'll stop there, and just again, really appreciate being here with you for the Strengthening Democracy event.
Thanks so much, Amber. We really appreciate it. Now that we've heard that awesome rundown of both Amber's experience and, quite frankly, her experience working across the country, we're going to move on to Weston Miller, who's our public policy director, and welcome him to the conversation. Weston wears actually many hats at the organization, but his work in and outside of the lobby really enables Civic Nebraska to protect voting rights, innovate voter representation, and also help our state adopt the very best voter-centric processes. Not only do we value his work in supporting pro-voter policies, perhaps more importantly, we thank Weston for helping keep voter suppression tactics out of Nebraska. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Weston. I will also note that he is the creator of the cocktail guide, which, I'm going to maybe go downstairs and get one real quick while I wait to wrap up. And all of you should do that too as you listen. So with that, Weston, it's all yours now.
Thanks, Adam. The cocktail guide is definitely the most important thing I've done this year. The rest is just extra. But everybody, I'm Weston. I'm Civic Nebraska's Director of Public Policy. Thanks for that introduction, Adam. Thanks again to Amber for being here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks to all of you for tuning in. This is exciting. Like Amber said, we have a lot to celebrate after Tuesday. We broke records for primary turnout. We broke records for vote by mail usage, despite some of the worst circumstances imaginable for running an election. So obviously, all of the credit for that goes to our election officials and administrators, but we're the folks that get to talk about some of the exciting things that happen. So thanks for being here and for tuning into the conversation. There's a chat open. Please feel free if you have extra questions for me or Amber, pop them in the chat and we will try to get to as many as we can. But Amber, let's just kind of start kind of on that celebratory note that you mentioned. So obviously Nebraska made a big push for voting at home this year, given the COVID-19 situation. And we did see a record turnout despite a pandemic. I guess from a national perspective, did that surprise you? Or is that happening in other states too that are focusing on vote by mail or voting at home?
Sure. Well, we'll have to see where Nebraska comes out with everyone else. But what's interesting is the states that have had the highest turnout in this primary season have predominantly had their voters vote by mail. And so Colorado right now was sort of top of the list at more than 50%. Washington is right in there, and both of them had March primaries when the pandemic was really starting to spin up in various states, including especially Washington. Wisconsin also, the majority of electors voted in their April election by mail, and they were the third highest in terms of turnout. We'll have to see where you all land in that landscape, but the majority of states that are in that top echelon for primary turnout, they predominantly voted by mail. And I think, number one, it's a testament to the reform itself and the method of voting and that it provides convenience. But number two, I think it also, in some of these states, especially Wisconsin or some of the states that have had to make significant modifications in a very short period of time to their election process, it's a testament to the election officials last minute making significant adjustments in the most difficult circumstances and most difficult way possible, and oftentimes with one policy hand tied behind their back. And what I mean by that is not getting the support they needed from their legislative bodies and from their policymakers to give them the tools to succeed. And Wisconsin made it across the finish line, but in a very difficult and very tough race.
Yeah, absolutely. And I that's something I'd love to ask you about, because obviously across the country, election officials are working in total overdrive to make this happen, despite the circumstances. As a former election official, could you give the rest of us kind of a glimpse of what they've been going through? Maybe even not in a pandemic year, but certainly now. And then maybe talk about how having expanded voter options could impact their jobs, both in the upcoming general election or just future elections.
Sure. Well, look, like I was an election official for 14 years, and I think everyone assumes that when there's not an election happening, there's downtime, right? I never experienced downtime in the 14 years that I ran elections. And what I mean by that is you're constantly planning for the next one. And a presidential election cycle, there's extraordinary circumstances kind of all around. There's always something that happens that you don't expect. Maybe your equipment shows up later than you thought and you've got to implement that. Maybe poll workers, you don't get as many as you expect, which tends to be the number one issue that election officials cite as being problematic. Maybe you can't get enough polling locations scheduled. All these things kind of come up. And election officials are always planning for, they've got their plan A, they've got their B, their C, their D, and usually even farther out from that, because you just never know what's going to happen. And so that's sort of normal. And then you introduce a pandemic that hasn't happened in 100 years in this same way. And, you know, the last time we saw this was 1920 with Spanish flu, lowest turnout on record at that time of any president, any election, because there weren't many options back then, and people couldn't interact. And so, fast forward 100 years later, there's two other historic things that were happening in 1920 versus now, and that was the 19th Amendment was marching across the finish line, which almost didn't happen because of the pandemic and the Spanish flu that was happening. And now we're fast forward 100 years when we're trying to celebrate the women's vote centennial, and that's sort of a lot of those activities have also been upended. So elections are tough regardless. And then you introduced a pandemic, and even California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, all of that, they still have to make adjustments. So there's even adjustments being made in these states, not as many as others, but still a lot for them to deal with. And so then you look at states where they're less than 10% normally of absentee ballots. That means they likely don't have much equipment that can process those ballots. That means they're not used to that kind of volume. That means that they may not even have adequate space to process all of those ballots internally. That means they potentially don't have large scale equipment to process those ballots when they come in. So a ton of changes. And what's really difficult about it is, in many ways, it would honestly be easier if all election officials around the country knew that they were going to mail ballots to everyone come September. And the reason I say that is they'd be able to buy their equipment, they'd put their orders in for envelopes and paper and all these things right now, and they would have that predictability that I mentioned earlier about the benefits of operating a model this way. Right now, the challenge in many states is they don't know how many people are going to want to vote this way. We're seeing exponential increases, and up to this point in a presidential year, we've normally seen 30% or less voters vote by absentee. I think it could be close to 70% this year. And so when election officials don't know, they essentially have to shoot really high in terms of their orders, materials, all that stuff. But by not knowing and not having that predictability, it makes it really impossible right now to plan, because given that in most states it's a request process, it's not up to election officials, it's not up to policymakers, it's not up to elected officials, it's up to the voters to decide. And right now they are choosing in the highest volumes we've ever seen to request their ballot to be mailed to them at home. And so what I've been saying is the increase is inevitable. And so it doesn't really matter what those historic trends were. There's an increase that's happening in an incredible way. And we have to make sure every state is prepared for that as they go into November, so that voters get their ballots, election officials can do their work, and we can proceed on and have a good election in the fall.
And it seems like, I can't imagine a circumstance in which the number of voters who choose to vote by mail is going to go down, because it seems like here it takes exactly one time to realize how convenient, just how great of an option it is. Is that true in other states too? Is that true in Colorado?
Yeah, that's what we saw over time is when we had the request process, we got up to the 72% or so of Coloradans asking for a ballot. And percentage of voters that had not requested it were calling us saying, hey, my neighbor got a ballot, my roommate got a ballot, why didn't you send me one? And so it was sort of the reverse, where the majority was those that were requesting and the minority were those that weren't, and they were the most confused because they didn't have the same service in terms of the ballot coming to them. So that's like, we don't really see the trend go backwards. We've never seen a situation where a state has 70% or whatever vote by mail, and then next time it's 20. Voters usually, if that behavior shifts and it's positive and it's a good experience for them, it doesn't necessarily shift backwards. And I think you guys have seen that around your state with the number of counties that have now gone to all vote by mail systems. They're not likely, and I don't think there's been any that have shifted back because they've had a good experience with that and their voters like it.
Yeah, it's been very fun to talk to some county officials in Nebraska, especially in those counties who have gone entirely by mail, and just even if they acknowledge there's, of course, administrative work up front that has to be done to make any sort of change, the county officials just seem thrilled with the overall experience for the voter. It's so customer service centric, like you mentioned earlier. And it's, yeah, it just seems like a really, really positive experience. I want to kind of on this note, I do want to ask you our first, you hear me okay, Amber? Uh-oh, I'm not sure Amber can hear me. So we might hold on for 1 second.
Can't hear. Okay, hold on.
I can still hear you. Stand by. All right, how's that, Amber? This is a
Okay.
great to grab a cocktail.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I sure can.
Okay, sorry about that. I couldn't hear any of that on the audio. I apologize.
Oh, that's okay.
The audio went out on the computer.
No problem. Okay, so I was just saying how it's fun to talk to some Nebraska officials who are having very like similar positive experiences, both with the customer service experience of voting at home, but also just the administrative efficiency that can come with it. So that's really cool to hear. I do want to ask our first question from the YouTube chat that's very similar to this topic. So Daniel from Scottsbluff wants to know that if county administrators or county officials want to expand the use of vote by mail in their county, what are some of the biggest changes that they need to start thinking about?
Sure. Well, if they want to switch, I mean, looking at things like the types of equipment, what they have, what their volume looks like, do they need to make adjustments like that internally? Those are sort of really key because that usually takes longer to order. The other thing that's really important is, depending on the size of the county, do they have an ability to prepare all of those ballots to mail out from their own office? Or does it make sense, for instance, to collaborate maybe with multiple counties and procure and share the services of maybe a vendor? And that is an interesting way to look at it. And that's something that we've recommended in we've written a vote at home scaling plan, and that's on our website. And that's one of the things we've recommended is for counties to think more broadly than just sort of their individual county and whether or not they can share services, whether that be printing and mailing services. Maybe they can leverage ordering envelopes in larger quantities together. Maybe they even think about sharing a processing center. So we've also been talking about, does it make sense for each individual county to buy counting equipment, even though there may be a better way to do that where they share a larger high-speed scanner and it costs them less money. So there's a real opportunity, I think, to think about this, not in the way that we've always done it, as I mentioned before, but think about how we can not only implement now, but implement for the future where we potentially preserve costs, think about it in a new and engaging way, and make sure that counties have that ability to be flexible, get things at a better rate, all of those sorts of things. So there's a lot of ways to do it and a lot to think about. There's certainly time right now to implement some of these changes ahead of November, but the clock is ticking. And I think it's sort of what do we do now and in 2020, and then what do we do in 2021 after that, and how does that look?
Great. And I want to take just one more quick question from the YouTube chat related to kind of the policy behind counties choosing to do this. Someone asked, is it a county decision to decide to vote by mail? So do counties need to decide for themselves? So I can answer on the Nebraska side. We have kind of a combo of permissions in the state. So our smaller counties, those with fewer than 10,000 residents, can submit an application to the Secretary of State to say, hey, we'd like to run all of our elections using a vote by mail standard, and the Secretary of State will approve or reject that application. Larger counties don't have that option to even engage in that conversation. That's a barrier that Civic Nebraska would like to see removed. Is that similar to processes in other states? Is it kind of, is it pretty sporadic across the country? Or is there a consistent kind of set of rules for who's allowed to make this decision on a county or state level?
Yeah, well, so what's interesting about what you all are doing in Nebraska is Washington did something similar, and so did California, in that they allowed their counties to make the decision. However, they didn't limit that to the size of the jurisdiction. They treated counties equally in how they were adopting. Can you hear me? Oh, okay, sorry. I wasn't sure if Steve was pointing at me. So there has been this sort of precedent set of county opt-in, and then we've seen that in a few states. That also is something that North Dakota currently does, where it's sort of a county opt-in. The odd thing I think about Nebraska is that they sort of give more options to smaller counties versus larger counties. And to me, it would make more sense to empower local jurisdictions, regardless of their size, to make these decisions and think about what would work best for their county, regardless of the size or the makeup of their jurisdiction.
Awesome. Thanks, Amber. So let's pivot to another kind of part of this conversation. So the pandemic is yet another way to think about election security. Obviously, you can't talk about elections without talking about how to keep them, safe and preserve their integrity. I think that means different things for different people. That can mean digital security. It can mean ballot integrity. It can mean voter suppression. I know that you've talked a lot about security being one of the major benefits of a voting at home model. Could you kind of walk us through, I guess, your thought process on that?
Sure. Well, I think there's a lot of ways actually that a vote at home system enhances security. First and foremost, on the voter registration front, and that's sort of the first step in which voters enter the voting process, is they register to vote, and then they have to maintain their address. If they move, they need to update their address, all those things. So the voter registration aspect of this is really important in terms of security. And the reason is that if you move or you update your address or you move across the state, you have to provide that information or you're not going to receive your ballot, because the ballot only goes to the residential address on file. And if you move, that ballot's going to be returned undeliverable. So you have to take action and you have to do that. And that's something that in states that have done this a long time, voters get used to that activity. But those states have also made other changes in their voter registration processes, like implementing automatic voter registration and automatic address updates for all government systems. So anytime you interact with a government entity, essentially within a state, your address will potentially get updated if you make that change, so that you don't have to fill out multiple forms as a constituent. And that all feeds into that security, where we're continually making sure that we know where voters are in terms of their voter registration information. And then we send the ballot out to you. And that ballot comes out, it's a paper ballot, unless you have specific other needs. Depending on a state, they allow accessible options to vote at home as well. But that ballot comes out to you. If you're no longer there, it comes back undeliverable. It can't be forwarded. It can't do any of those things. The other thing that I would say is, when that ballot comes out to you, unlike in-person voting, we're doing that sort of address check, right? So we're confirming that what we have in the database for voter registration purposes is where you are, because it's coming to find you. The ballot is coming to find you. In-person voting, that's not necessarily the process that happens. We don't necessarily do that address check. And so you, in theory, could go to your old polling place or that kind of thing and never actually update your address. So that doesn't happen in that same way. When you vote your ballot, once you fill that out at home and vote your ballot, you're going to send that back in, and it's going to go through a process of signature verification. And what that means is, we're comparing the signature that you provided when you registered to vote, or when you got your driver's license, or when you filled out a form, or even when you filled out a ballot previously. We're going to check that and compare that to what's on that affidavit on the outside of the envelope before the ballot proceeds. So if someone, for instance, gets a hold of your ballot that shouldn't have it for whatever reason, and they try to return that, the signature will get flagged because it won't match your signature. So this is sort of the process that most of the states that have done this for a long period of time and also do it widely, that's what they utilize. The other aspect of security that I just want to mention is something called ballot tracking. And so in 2009, way back in 2009, 11 years ago in Denver, we created the first ever ballot trace and ballot tracking solution for mail ballots. And what it does is it enables you to track your mail ballot just like you would a FedEx or UPS package, where you know where it is at every point in the process. You get that accountability, you get the transparency to know where it is. All of that enhances security and certainly confidence. Oh.
All right, we're going to take a hot second while we try to resolve some audio. Amber has officially reached outer space. She's coming to us live from a space station. Give us just one sec. Another shameless plug. Grab a democracy cocktail while you wait. I believe the link is in the chat. And Amber, that actually was my next question, was about that ballot tracking system. I think that in my mind, that's the biggest infrastructure piece that Nebraska is missing, is a proactive, a really proactive, user-friendly tracking system. Oh, now I'm hearing more feedback. All right, we're gonna keep tracking. There we go, it's fixed. But I think the need for a proactive notification system for our ballot tracking is, I think, really essential. We have a system where voters can go online and look up their ballot and look up the status, which works for me because I know it exists, I know where to find it. But I had a lot of conversations just with peers who, weren't aware that system existed. And I think that the tracking process is really related to the curing process, right? I think one of the biggest, one of the most important elements of a strong vote by mail system is the ability for voters to know if and when their ballot is rejected, and then how to solve that problem. So Amber, could you talk about how the curing process can be improved through the use of something like Ballot Trace? I'm assuming you saw a pretty big improvement in that system.
Sure. So the ballot tracking system, it gives you that accountability, and it's not unlike getting an Amazon delivery at home, right? Where you get the status updates. And then if the signature doesn't match, you get that immediate notification that there's an issue with your signature, and then you get instructions on how to cure that and how to engage to figure that out. The other thing that's really great about a ballot tracking system is that you also, through it, we can send you updates, proactive updates to say, hey, you got a ballot and the election is a week away, or the election is in. A lot of options on how to do that.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, I think that's how organizations first got connected, is we had some of our folks come to Denver and hear about this cool ballot trace program, and we were just blown away by how just user-friendly it was, and how it just really, to us, is kind of the epitome of a customer service model of running elections. Like, that notification system, I think, just encourages so much trust in the process, which is really awesome.
Yeah, it certainly does.
So I want to talk about kind of the political side of really any voting reform, but specifically voting by mail and voting at home, because unfortunately you can't talk about voting without talking about the political realities of that. It seems like recently on the national level, political parties have gotten super involved in the vote by mail conversation because of the coronavirus. I've seen in Nebraska that one of the unfortunate results of that is there's this false perception that exists that now states have to offer either vote by mail or in-person voting, and those seem to be like the two politically charged choices. You've got to pick whatever team you're on. Could you kind of respond to that either or mindset? Because I know you mentioned earlier that in Colorado you've realized you don't have to make that decision.
Yeah, I mean, we don't advocate for all of one or the other, and what I think is the best way to look at it is sort of how I described that. Instead of having it be an opt-in process for mail-in voting, we've essentially made it an opt-out process, meaning we're going to assume that you want that ballot at home and it's going to come to you. You have that predictability. And then if you decide that you want to go in person, you can do that. The other option, the kind of secondary option to that, is keeping opt-in, but making that process easier for voters to engage with. So maybe it's a single sign-up opt-in where you can sign up for all future elections, or that request is always online and it makes it easy for the voters to engage in. So making that kind of streamlining that process of opting in is really important for a lot of states to do right now, because they probably won't get to that full opt-out model, but at least they can streamline that opt-in process to make it easier for election officials to engage in. And as I always talk about, this is not a partisan issue. It's really about putting voters first. All the data that's been done on this topic, which has been very well researched, by the way, over a long period of time, indicates that there's not a partisan advantage. There has not been a partisan advantage one way or another. It just simply boosts engagement for every voter in the election process. And that's really important, because election policies and reforms that we talk about have to be about who votes, not who votes, and how we can make the process easier for voters in a safe, secure, and accessible way, and not try to play games with the rules to try to dissuade a particular outcome. And that's really important. And I think that for the most part, in most states, we're seeing that at the local level, there's a lot of discussions about how do we solve problems? How do we provide voting services in a pandemic? And the DC discussion, as usual, is usually a little bit different than what's actually happening on the ground in most states. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, that's definitely true in Nebraska. The contrast between the DC conversation and the Nebraska conversation is pretty stark. That's another misconception that we have to work on, is the idea that, yeah, vote by mail is a tool that increases turnout for Democrats only or for liberal candidates only. One of the reasons I love working on this issue in Nebraska specifically is because the drive for expanded voter options, especially in entire precincts or entire counties, it's been driven entirely by a few counties in western Nebraska, almost all of which have very, very strong Republican registration advantages. So this is not the idea of vote by mail being a liberal tool just doesn't make any sense here. I'm going to pause 1 second and grabbing some more audio trouble. We also saw in the most recent election, 2 days ago, we had an election which had incredibly high turnout due in large part to the expanded use of vote by mail. We had a Republican candidate for U.S. Senate break I believe it was the record for most primary votes cast for a candidate ever. So that idea that this is some sort of, a tool that benefits one side or the other just really does not match with the data that we see here on the ground.
Okay, I'm back. I can hear you now.
Excellent. Glad to hear it. I was just saying that, again, that DC conversation is not matching at all with our Nebraska data. We've got, the entire drive towards vote by mail has been driven by counties that do not match the, whatever progressive poster child has been created for voting by mail. I want to make one more check for questions from the YouTube chat here. I don't see any new ones, but kind of on that note of political results and affiliation, it has been really fun to see the results from, 48 hours ago now, less than. And the political affiliations in different counties in Nebraska are not mysterious. They're pretty strong, and you know which is which. And just every county has seen such a significant increase in turnout, regardless of the political affiliation of their voters, regardless of whether they had an intense race for legislature or for Congress or whatever. Just, it seems to me like when vote by mail is available and promoted, turnout just goes up, period, regardless of who people are voting for.
Yeah, we've seen that across the board. And what's interesting about that is the primary turnout, local elections, school board elections, that's where we see the biggest increase usually in turnout, because those are the elections that don't get as much attention, don't get all the advertising dollars, don't always have that happen. So it's easier for voters to understand when that ballot shows up at their door, because traditionally those sort of localized or primary elections aren't as aren't as widely known.
Absolutely. Amber, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask just kind of one more broad question, because you obviously have such vast experience on this issue, running elections, running vote by mail elections especially. As you become more familiar with Nebraska specifically, do you have any more thoughts either for election officials, for us as voting rights advocates, just general thoughts about, the direction that Nebraska elections are headed? We'd just love to hear any maybe your final thoughts you've got for us.
Sure. Well, I think that there's certainly ways to improve the process. I think that there's ways that every state could improve the process. Today, we actually rolled out a 50-state matrix and analysis where we essentially rated each state in terms of where they are on a set of about 30 different policy objectives, all that touch on vote by mail. So we did a deep dive into every state around the country, grouped the states depending on where they are in that spectrum, and made various policy recommendations. So I think with Nebraska, taking a look at that right now, there are things in there that you don't need legislation for. One of the technologies and innovation pieces that I always talk about that you don't need legislation for is the ballot tracking aspect. You also don't need legislation to just simply improve the design of your envelopes and instructions, and that's one way to just even improve the process. So there's lots of just even improve the process. So there's lots of. Hold on, sorry, the audio came back suddenly. So that policy matrix, I think, provides a good guidebook for all states to look at, because what we've tried to do is really separate out, here's the legal changes that you can make, here's the policy considerations, here's how this would improve the process. Again, not saying that you're going to be all vote by mail tomorrow, but instead just saying, look, here's how this could be improved for election officials. And I think it's really important to ask election officials. I think it'd be great for policymakers across Nebraska to go meet with each of their county election officials post this recent election and ask them how it went. What would they change? What would they improve? What would be their suggestions for next time? And what do they need for November to get their jobs done? Because when you can get policymakers connected with the local election officials that are on the ground running the process, understanding what challenges they face, what their number one issues are, policymakers can do a much better job of legislating around those issues that improves not only that process for those frontline workers and election officials that are delivering this service, but by extension improves the process overall for every single elector. And so I would encourage all the policymakers, the advocacy groups to try to convene those types of settings and meetings to bring election officials with policymakers, with stakeholders, with advocacy groups, to have those very deep conversations about how to improve the process. And every state is going to be different about this, and there's going to be different circumstances and different variables that states are going to face and challenges that they're going to overcome. And so it's important to design a process that works for Nebraska and accomplishes making the voting experience better for all Nebraskans. And that might be very different than, say, what a California's process looks like. And, the one thing I would say about California is they've actually done this. They've created a convening where they have election officials with policymakers, with advocacy organizations, with different community groups. And they actually have just been meeting over the last 2 months every week, and usually a couple subgroups also during the week, to talk about what to do for November. And they collectively came up with a set of recommendations that ultimately went to the governor and went to the Secretary of State's office. So they did that. They got together and they did that. And I think that Nebraska doing something exactly like that, where we bring everyone to the table that this touches, including, frankly, important.
And Amber, you might have just touched on this. We lost the audio there for 1 second, but the final note I did want to end on. We've got a few folks watching who are are just voters who are just really interested in this idea. And I think they understand why it's such a useful tool for our state. Just as an individual voter, who doesn't get to hang out in the lobby all day or doesn't have,
Sure.
those daily conversations. If a voter just wants to encourage, their elected officials or their county or their state to embrace this tool, what's something that, a Nebraska voter could do tomorrow or next week to try to move the needle on this issue?
Well, I always encourage voters to share their stories. If you had a good experience about the way you voted, or you feel strongly about encouraging others to vote this way, share your stories and write to your legislators and call them and encourage them to give that option to your friends in other counties or across the state. And then write op-eds, right? Engage in that level where you encourage change. And there's, now with all the social media platforms, there's lots of ways to do that quickly. There's also opportunities to engage across the state, set up Zoom meetings and talk about, why this matters and why it's important. But I think sharing individual stories are the most powerful way to encourage policymakers and others to consider change. Because it's change can be scary, and if we've always done it a certain way, it's hard to anticipate. It's hard to see how that might be different, and there's going to be fear. Fear is always associated with change. I always say that change is the biggest barrier that we face with regards to making elections better, because there's an unknown, and some people need to see it and need to understand it a little bit more than maybe what they have before to figure out what that change could look like and eliminate some of the myths and the fears associated with a potential change.
Awesome. Well, Amber, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for being a part of this conversation. And thanks to all of you watching. Thanks for watching our first ever Strengthening Democracy live stream. Kind of the whole name of the game here is adapting to the circumstances. So thank you all for being willing to do that and attending and being a part of the conversation. Before anybody signs off, our development team has put together a very fun Civic Nebraska promotion package for 2 lucky winners. So what we did was we assigned a random number to everybody who pre-registered for the event, and we used the most democratic and fair system we could find, which is a random number generator. So these are 2 folks who registered ahead of time, and we're going to send you an email and give you some free Civic Nebraska swag. So our winners today are Dylan Oftenkamp and Jessica Kennedy Matthew. So if you're watching, stay tuned. Liz and Sarah are going to reach out, and we will send you some Civic Nebraska swag. And of course, Amber and her team are going to get some as well, because we really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with us. And with that, thank you all again so much. And I'm going to turn it back over to Adam.
Well, thank you so much, Weston. And thank you to our special guest speaker, Amber McReynolds, again, for incredible insights into voting-centric activation and policy. Also, I just want to thank Weston Miller for moderating such a great conversation about voting in 2020. And also thank all of our viewers for watching tonight. And then also, being understanding about technical stuff. We all know how that goes in the world of Zoom and all those types of meetings. I think it's really important to note, and we already talked about it. I mean, Nebraskans have casted a record high amount of votes in the primary election. That just happened just 48 hours ago. Despite public health concerns, our state safely turned out to vote and made their voice heard with these record numbers. Opportunities to get involved in Civic Nebraska are available on our website at civicnebraska.org. And to ensure that our incredible staff can continue doing this work each and every day by supporting neighborhood civic health, building up young community leaders, and ensuring that elections are modern and accessible, please consider making a donation tonight in honor of how you strengthen democracy. Donation opportunities are posted below in the live chat, or at least I hope they are. And we want to thank you so much for joining us tonight, and good night, everyone. Take care.